Jack Turner was a young cowboy, only 22 years old, but already yearning for something greater than his simple life on the plains of Texas. Born on the wide, open fields, he had always loved the freedom that came with being a cowboy. His father had taught him the ropes early on, how to ride horses, manage cattle, and live by the cowboy code of hard work and self-reliance. Yet, despite all the skills he'd mastered, Jack felt something missing deep inside. He had a restless feeling, a sense that he hadn't yet proven himself to the world. Jack's life up until that point had been a series of simple days spent riding across the open range, moving cattle from one place to another, with nothing to look forward to except the endless horizon. But that all changed when Jack's travels led him to a remote corner of New Mexico, a place he never expected to visit. It wasn't cattle he was after anymore, it was adventure. Little did he know, this part of his journey would change him forever. It started when Jack accidentally wandered into Apache territory. The moment he realized his mistake, it was already too late. A small group of Apache warriors had spotted him, and before he could turn his horse around to leave, they surrounded him. Jack knew little about the Apache tribe, but had heard enough stories to know they were not a group to cross. He tried to explain he meant no harm, but the language barrier made it impossible. As they captured him, Jack felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. It wasn't just the threat of violence that troubled him. It was the uncertainty of what would happen next. Among the group of Apache warriors was a young woman named Ayanna. She was the daughter of the tribe's chief, tall and strong, with dark eyes that could pierce through a person's soul. Ayanna had heard many things about the outside world, about the settlers and cowboys who tried to push into their land. She had seen the damage that outsiders had caused to her people and their way of life, but she had never actually met one of them face to face until now. She watched Jack with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The tribe's elders had discussed what to do with the young cowboy, unsure of his intentions. Ayanna, however, had her own opinion about the matter. The decision came quickly. In a surprising move, Ayanna's father ordered that Jack be held prisoner, but also forced into an arranged marriage with Ayanna herself. This was meant to solidify peace between their tribe and the settlers, a decision rooted in pragmatism. The tribe's old ways had long been undermined by the expansion of settlers, and Ayanna's marriage to Jack, though unthinkable, was a political solution that could keep the peace for the time being. For Jack, it was nothing short of a shock. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn, and now he had no choice but to accept it. At first, Jack resisted. He protested, even begged to be released. But in the end, there was no escaping the situation. The marriage was a done deal, and Ayanna's father made it clear that it was for the good of both their people. Jack had no choice but to go along with it, though he was unsure of how to approach Ayanna. She too was unwilling to embrace this arrangement. After all, she had her own history, her own fears, and her own idea of what love and partnership should look like. Jack was nothing like what she had imagined, and the feeling of being forced into a union with a stranger left her with a cold bitterness. As the days passed, Jack and Ayanna were kept isolated from the rest of the tribe, sent to a small, barren stretch of land on the edge of the desert. Here they would honeymoon, as the elders called it, though there was nothing romantic about it. The scorching heat of the desert, the barren surroundings, and the lack of comfort made it clear that this wasn't a typical honeymoon. Jack had no idea how to live in the harsh conditions of the desert, and he quickly realized how little he knew about surviving outside of the familiar plains of Texas. He had always thought of himself as tough, but now he felt weak and inexperienced. The situation felt like a trap, a place where he was forced to confront the man he had yet to become. Ayanna, too, found herself struggling. She was used to the desert, used to the traditions of her people, but the idea of being married to a stranger was difficult for her. She had suffered losses in her life, had seen her world change in ways that left her distrustful of outsiders. Her first marriage had ended tragically, and now, forced into this union, she found herself questioning everything she had believed in. Her pride, her culture, and her identity all clashed with the reality she was now facing. She kept her distance from Jack emotionally and physically. Every time he tried to speak to her, she met him with coldness. Yet despite the tension between them, there was something undeniable about their situation. They were alone with no one else to turn to. As the days turned into weeks, Jack began to notice little things about Ayanna, how she moved so gracefully across the desert, how she knew the land in ways he could never understand, and how her strength came not just from her physical ability, but from her unwavering spirit. Jack's initial frustration with the situation slowly began to change. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was now a partner in survival. He started to learn from Ayanna. He learned how to start a fire in the harsh desert winds, how to find water in the dry ground, and how to hunt using the methods of the Apache people. Ayanna, on the other hand, began to notice Jack's persistence. He wasn't the naive cowboy he had seemed at first. She saw how he pushed through his struggles and slowly adapted to the unforgiving desert life. Though she never expressed it aloud, she began to see Jack in a new light, not just as a captive, but as someone capable of growth and change. The longer they were alone together, the more she understood that Jack wasn't a boy anymore. He was becoming a man, one who could stand alongside her in the face of challenges. But even with this new understanding between them, there was still a barrier that neither of them knew how to cross. Jack wanted to be more than just a cowboy to Ayanna. He wanted to be someone she could rely on, someone she could trust. But how could he prove himself when their worlds were so different? Ayanna, too, was unsure of what to make of this young man who had been thrust into her life so unexpectedly. Could she learn to trust him? Could she let go of her anger and resentment toward the settlers and accept Jack for who he was? Their relationship was complicated, built on layers of tension, resentment, and unspoken words. Yet, beneath it all, a new kind of respect was forming. Jack began to realize that being a man wasn't just about physical strength. It was about resilience, perseverance, and the ability to adapt. He wasn't the boy who had set out on his journey looking for adventure anymore. He was starting to become someone capable of facing life's challenges head-on, not just for himself but for someone else too. Ayanna, for her part, began to let down her guard. Slowly, she allowed herself to see Jack not just as a symbol of the settlers, but as an individual. She had suffered enough to know that life wasn't always fair, and sometimes survival meant making tough decisions. She didn't need to like the marriage or the circumstances, but she began to understand that Jack wasn't her enemy. He was simply another soul caught in the same storm. Though they still had a long way to go, the days spent together in the desert were slowly forging a bond between Jack and Ayanna. They were both trapped, but in different ways. Jack had yet to truly understand what it meant to be a man, and Ayanna was still trying to find a way to reconcile her past with her present. But with each passing day, their journey together was shaping both of them in ways neither could have predicted. The desert was vast and empty, but it was also full of possibilities. And as the sun set each night, casting long shadows over the dry earth, both Jack and Ayanna realized that the road ahead of them would not only determine their survival, but their transformation into something new. Neither of them knew it yet, but one fateful night would change everything for both of them. As the days passed in the desert, Jack Turner and Ayanna found themselves settling into an uncomfortable rhythm. The isolation they faced in the dry, unforgiving land had a way of wearing down even the strongest of spirits. Every morning the sun would rise, casting a golden light across the barren landscape, and they would begin their routine, gathering water, hunting for food, and working together to survive. For Jack, these tasks felt like a test, each one a small step toward proving that he was more than the naive cowboy who had wandered into Apache territory months ago. But even as Jack tried to rise to the challenge, he couldn't ignore the weight of the isolation. The silence of the desert, broken only by the sounds of the wind or the occasional rustle of small animals, pressed down on him. He often found himself staring out at the endless horizon, wondering what lay beyond, and questioning whether he'd ever leave this place. His relationship with Ayanna remained distant, despite the long days spent in each other's company. They communicated more out of necessity than anything else, and each word exchanged was still laced with the tension of their forced marriage. Though Jack could see the strength in Ayanna, there was still a wall between them, a wall built from anger, pride, and the past. Ayanna, too, struggled with the weight of their situation. She had been raised to understand the land, to trust in the traditions of her people, but the arrangement with Jack had forced her to question everything she knew. The past few months had been a blur of confusion. She had been forced to marry a man she didn't know, and for the most part she resented him for it. Jack was a stranger, someone from a different world, a world that had caused so much pain to her people. Yet despite her feelings of anger, she couldn't deny that Jack had shown signs of change. He was no longer the reckless cowboy who had stumbled into their territory. There was something different about him now, something stronger. One day, as the midday sun blazed overhead, a violent storm rolled in from the mountains. The winds howled as dust and sand filled the air, blurring everything in sight. It wasn't long before the storm became a full-blown downpour, turning the dry ground into mud and flooding the small shelter they had built. They had no choice but to seek refuge in a nearby cave, hoping to escape the worst of the storm. The night ahead would be long and filled with danger. As they entered the cave, the storm outside grew fiercer. The wind howled like a wild animal, shaking the rocks above them. Inside the cave, it was dark and cold, but the shelter it provided was the only safe place they had. Jack and Ayanna, now forced together by the elements, found themselves in an unfamiliar position. The physical space in the cave was small, and there was nowhere to go but to sit together. Ayanna, still keeping her distance, huddled against one side of the cave, her face lit only by the dim light of a small fire that Jack had managed to start. The storm continued its assault, the rain pouring down in torrents as thunder cracked above them. The tension between Jack and Ayanna, which had been building over the months, finally reached a boiling point. In the thick of the storm, they were both faced with their fears and frustrations. Jack had never been one to share his emotions, especially not with a woman he barely knew. But the isolation, the fear of the storm, and the sheer helplessness of their situation began to break down the walls inside him. He couldn't stay silent anymore, not with Ayanna sitting so close. "Why are you so cold?" Jack asked, his voice rough from the dry air. He was surprised at himself for even asking. It wasn't like him to open up, but something about the storm and the solitude made it feel necessary. Ayanna, who had been staring into the fire, turned her head slowly to meet his gaze. There was a moment of silence between them before she spoke, her voice low and measured. "You don't understand," she said, her words tinged with bitterness. "You're just like the others. You come here and think you can take what you want, change everything. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." Jack didn't speak right away. He hadn't expected her to open up so easily, but the truth of her words hit him hard. He didn't understand. He had never lived the life Ayanna had. He had never faced the kind of loss and hardship she had endured. But in that moment, he realized how much he still had to learn. Ayanna's words stirred something inside him, a sense of guilt perhaps, but also a deep desire to understand her, to earn her trust. "I'm sorry," Jack said, his voice quiet. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I don't know what you've been through, but I want to learn. I want to understand." Ayanna didn't answer him right away. Instead, she turned back to the fire, her face unreadable. The storm outside raged on, but the air inside the cave seemed to shift. For the first time in months, there was a sense of understanding between them, even if it was just the smallest spark. As the night wore on, the storm slowly began to subside. The wind calmed and the rain became little more than a gentle drizzle, yet the tension that had hung over them like a heavy cloud didn't completely vanish. Still, something had changed. They had spoken honestly, and for the first time, Jack felt a sense of connection with Ayanna. It was a fragile connection, built on words and silence, but it was something. The next morning, the storm was gone and the desert was quieter than before. The world outside the cave had been transformed by the rain. The land, once dry and cracked, was now full of life, the soil rich with moisture. Jack and Ayanna stepped out of the cave, blinking against the bright sunlight that greeted them. They stood together for a moment, silently taking in the beauty of the world that had survived the storm. But just as Jack was beginning to think that perhaps they could work together, something unexpected happened. A pack of wild coyotes appeared in the distance, moving quickly through the brush. They were headed straight toward the shelter where Jack and Ayanna had stored their food. Jack's first instinct was to grab his rifle and protect their supplies, but he hesitated. He realized that Ayanna, who had been taught to survive in this land since birth, might have a better idea of how to handle the situation. Ayanna turned to him with a knowing look in her eyes. "Let me handle this," she said quietly. Without waiting for Jack's response, she moved swiftly toward the coyotes, her step sure and confident. Jack watched in awe as Ayanna used the tools of her people, setting up a trap with remarkable skill. She moved as though she had done this countless times before, her actions fluid and precise. Within moments, she had driven the coyotes away without a single shot fired. Jack stood there, stunned by the sight. He had never seen someone move so effortlessly, so confidently in the wild. In that moment, he realized just how much he still had to learn, not just about survival, but about life itself. Ayana wasn't just a woman from a different tribe. She was a master of the land, a person who had lived through hardship and come out stronger. And Jack? He was still a man who had only just begun to understand the world around him. That day, something clicked inside Jack. He wasn't the same cowboy who had wandered into Apache territory months ago. He had grown. He had learned. And though he still had much to understand about Ayana, he had begun to see her as a partner, someone to respect and rely on. Their time together had forced him to face the man he could become. As the days passed, Jack and Ayana's relationship slowly began to shift. There was still tension, but it was no longer a wall between them. They were two people who had learned from each other, two people who had survived together. They had seen each other at their worst and had helped each other rise above it. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was respect. And in a place like the desert, respect was the foundation for everything else. The night they spent in the cave, battered by the storm, marked a turning point for both of them. It wasn't just the storm that changed their lives, it was the moment they both acknowledged their vulnerability, their fears, and their strength. Jack had become the man he had always wanted to be, not because of the cowboy skills he had mastered, but because he had learned how to truly survive, not just for himself but alongside someone else. In the end, it wasn't just one night that had turned Jack into a man. It was the long journey of survival, the understanding and the partnership that had grown between him and Ayana, and together they would face whatever came next, stronger than they had ever been before.